Welcome to Burning Platforms, a podcast about the politics of technology from the Centre for Responsible Technology. I'm Peter Lewis. I'll be joined by regular panellist, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton, as well as special guest, critic and author of There Be Monsters, Richard King. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. So it's been a few months since our last chat, but it's great to have our regular panel back in the room. Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea. G'day, Lizzie.
Hi, Peter.
And Dan Stinton, CEO of Health Engine and all-round good guy. Hi, Dan.
G'day, Peter.
And we've also got our special guest who will be going to the deep dive with later on, the critic and author of the book There Be Monsters, which I always feel like you should do it like you're growling like a pirate or something. Richard King. Thanks for joining us, Richard.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, guys.
So it has been a little, I reckon it's been 3 or 4 weeks since we all got together, and there's been a fair bit going on around the globe, a landmark test case, or a couple of them in the States, the big writers' strike. But let's start with the movement in the 40-year journey to see some movement on privacy laws. Lizzie, what came out of the Attorney General's office last week, and what do we think about it?
So the Attorney General has published his response to the review of the Privacy Act, which sounds boring, but for many people in the space, it's very exciting because we move closer now to privacy reform than we've ever been, really. And it's quite meaningful as well because the Privacy Act was introduced 40 years ago, and there have been changes to it, but not substantial ones that really address the key challenges of the digital age. And Australia really lags behind lots of other comparable democracies in protecting people's personal information and, kind of setting up some guardrails and some boundaries around the operation of surveillance capitalism. And so the response from the Attorney General really signals that this is going to happen, that there's a real appetite for reform among this Labor government. They've essentially accepted the vast majority of recommendations made by the review. They've accepted some of them with a bit more consultation required, but that is a pretty significant step. This review's been going on for years. It was first recommended by the ACCC in coming out of their digital platforms inquiry, looking at the power of platforms like Google and Facebook. And so there's a competition element to it, a consumer element to it, but there's also, a human rights element to it, which is what I'm interested in. And essentially what the Attorney General said, yes, he wants to update the definition of personal information, which, for example, doesn't include things like locational information. Yes, they want to introduce a fair and reasonable test. So it's not just ticker box consent, that it's actually, there's limits on what you can use personal information for once you've taken it from somebody. And then also the introduction of a statutory tort, which has been on the table in Australia among various law reform bodies for decades. So a private right of action to be able to sue companies who invade your privacy or individuals, and also a general kind of cause of action to enforce rights under the Privacy Act, which would be a huge step forward. And, in the United States, they don't have that, and tech companies have been really resisting it, investing a lot in lobbying to try and stop that happening. So the attorneys accepted that recommendation with a bit more consultation. And there's a few other things in there that I think are interesting, getting rid of the small business exemption. Some things that people won't be surprised about, which is the attorney has rejected the recommendation that the political parties exemption be removed. So political parties will still essentially be able to do what they like with personal information, which has surprised absolutely no one. But yeah,
albeit with some safeguards around it, albeit with some specific safeguards, as is the case, I think, with the journalism exemption.
Yeah, and I think what I was bracing for was a lot of opposition to this, particularly from the mainstream media, whose business model does rely on personal information now much more than it used to, particularly given that they're in the business of kind of targeted advertising. But the response from the media, I think, has been pretty mild, dare I say it, reasonable. There's some people who are objecting. Small businesses don't like the possibility of losing their exemption. And advertisers, Dan, as a former ad man, you'll be not at all shocked to learn that advertisers don't like this idea. And then, of course, the Australian was running a few objection lines along those kinds of lines. So there's a bit of political shenanigans, I think, going on. I'm sure the Business Council of Australia will come out and oppose it. But in general, I think this is, this is a good time for privacy advocates. They feel like there's movement and that a lot of the necessary reforms are on the table. It's a question of whether it will happen in the form of legislative reform. So we'll see.
So I guess it's important not to lock in these wins because there are a number that are like agreed in principle and need further consultation. And we know that always ends up being an opportunity for vested interest to pull things back. But I think most of us in the space were saying this is heading in the right direction. I know both you and I were out there, not backing it in, but saying this is heading in the right direction when it came out. Dan, I was interested in your colleagues from the advertising profession. There is a particular quote that I've pulled out from MI3 from one of the policy people at IAB who has a concern around the consent changes. The main problem is that targeting needs to be both fair and reasonable. So is that a fair and reasonable concern about these laws?
Yeah, I saw Sarah Walden's comments in that article. Look, I don't think that the concerns that she's raising are well, I don't think there's a significant issue. And I think, like Lizzie has outlined, I think that what the AG has outlined here is it's a pretty good start, actually. It's a pretty good package, and it surprises me how far they've gone. On that fair and reasonable question, Peter, I mean, yeah, now the collection and use of consumer data needs to be fair and reasonable. That's still ill-defined, but nonetheless, it's a pretty good starting position. And the other advantage of that, by the way, is that then you don't have to burden the consumer by asking for consent if it is fair and reasonable, which, means that at least we're going to have some respite from those consent banners, which litter the internet now and achieve virtually nothing because no one bothers to do anything other than hit yes anyway. So, yeah, I mean, should advertising be fair and reasonable? Clearly, yes. That's a really great thing, and I think that the advertising industry is, will come on board with this in time. I don't think there's an argument to be mounted against that. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more on the no-go zones, or sorry to say it again, but purpose limitations. I think the missed opportunity with what has been put out is that there's still no guardrails put on really large tech platforms being able to collect consumer data in one platform and use it in a completely different context for their own ends. And I think that's bad for privacy, and I also think it's bad for competition, and it's a real missed opportunity. I'm hopeful that someone else is going to pick up the baton now and bang on about this with the government and hopefully convince them to put something in place, because it really that's the one area where Australia could lead the world if we were to go just that step further and say, you know what, you can't read people's Gmails and sell them targeted advertising on YouTube. It's pretty reasonable thing to, I think, restrict. I think every consumer or every reasonable consumer would agree with it, and it would also have the impact of allowing smaller players in the advertising space to be able to compete. So it's a shame that that's not there. But look, I mean, it's amazing they've done this. I think it's incredible that it's come out before The Voice as well, which I wasn't expecting. I don't think many people were, and I think it's pretty promising beginning. So let's see where it goes.
Richard, you're from the world of words and literature. There have been very few songs sung or poems written about privacy law reform. How do you see it? And is this something that is just a few geeks like us getting excited about, or is there a bigger piece here?
Yeah, I don't think it's geeky. I think it's important and to have these things in place. But I do think that the whole sort of regulation discussion, if you like, does sort of leave unmolested the bigger issues about what this tech is doing to our being, so to speak. Yeah, I mean, as Dan was saying, the test will be the fair and reasonable definition, right? What does that mean? I mean, we all know that advertisers don't sell us products, they sell us versions of ourselves, right? We've known this since Vance Packard, and it's kind of it would be interesting to see how it emerges. But at least it's a sign of a new seriousness, I suppose. A recognition at the very least that there's something amiss here. People don't like it. Generally speaking, I think the kind of discussions that we have around privacy, and this isn't meant to sound dismissive at all, but they do tend to be the kinds of discussion that one would expect to be having in a liberal society where privacy, et cetera, and autonomy and yet the ownership of one's data is sort of sort of stressed, is esteemed, is the thing that kind of gets people going. And I suppose in the book, I don't want to jump the gun on that, but I suppose in the book, I wanted to get underneath that and start thinking about more, if you like, existential questions about the qualitative effect that these technologies are having on our lives and subjectivities. But no, I think it's a positive move overall.
Yeah, one of the points I think a number of us have made is that there's all these sort of very, very urgent inquiries going on at government around AI at the moment. There's 19 of them on board, all from different departments. The privacy reforms are kind of the building blocks. Like that's almost the foundations of having anything sensible come out the other end. So, hopefully it lands, and hopefully there will be people writing poems and songs about it at some stage in the future. Dan, let's move on to the big cases in the States. The Federal Trade Commissioner has launched proceedings against both Google and Amazon. Do you want to give us the greeting card versions of both of those? And I know why you don't want to choose your favorite child when it comes to big tech being prosecuted. Which one do you think is more significant?
Huge month for antitrust, as you touched on. So last month, the US Justice Department took action against Google for effectively abusing its power to monopolize search, and did that mainly through paying billions of dollars to be the default search engine on Apple and Samsung devices. That kicked things off. From what I'm reading, I'm no lawyer, I'll defer to Lizzie on this, but from what I'm reading, that one is a relatively strong case. And then last week, in what has been long expected, the FTC, led by Lina Khan, finally launched their major lawsuit against Amazon, and essentially accused it of having a monopoly in e-commerce, and using its power, if you like, in the online retail industry to I guess illegally disadvantage its rivals, leveraging tactics that punish sellers for offering lower prices elsewhere and coercing businesses into paying fairly exorbitant fees to use its fulfillment services. I think they're both significant, but I think because of, particularly in Australia, where Amazon is growing but isn't as dominant as it is in the US, I think particularly in Australia, the one that is more significant for us is Google. And I think in general, the one that is more significant is Google. Because the reason is that, the Google is effectively the gateway to the internet for most Australians and most people, in fact, around the world. And because of their dominance, basically the internet is a bit shit, excuse my language. The 10 blue links that was search, a decade or so ago, has really been replaced with about 5 or 6 sponsored links. And if you're lucky, you see 1 or 2 organic links somewhere down the bottom of the page. And what that means is consumers really can't avoid or tend to not being able to avoid, unless they really try, being able to click on something from Google search and avoid the ads. And what that means for the suppliers is that the suppliers are effectively having to pay a tax just to be discovered online, because Google is the front door to the internet. If you want to be discovered online, you have to pay the Google tax. And if you don't pay the Google tax, you don't get discovered. And this is a company which, is siphoning all of its profits over to low tax jurisdictions, and not paying its fair share of tax elsewhere. So it's a pretty disastrous circumstance. And I guess, I'll end on this point. I think just imagine a world where Bing and Yahoo had been able to keep a reasonable share of the market. In that world, we would probably have a circumstance where, there'd be more opportunity for organic discovery online, less obligation on companies to have to pay this tax to Google in order to be discovered. More power also to people like publishers or companies like publishers, because they'd be able to work with one search engine against others and potentially, reduce the dominance of Google in that front as well. And we just have a better internet. So that's the one that I'm hoping for the most. I really hope that it succeeds, but I'm not a lawyer, so who knows whether it's going to get anywhere. I hope so.
You're a lawyer, Lizzie. Does this have an application in Australia? What happens in the States?
I mean, technically, no, because we have different rules around antitrust, rules around what's permissible in terms of mergers and the like, although there are proposals to change that, particularly in light of the digital platforms inquiry. But, obviously, Lina Khan is a pretty significant appointment. She was appointed off the back of a paper that she wrote, which was called Amazon's Antitrust, the Amazon's antitrust paradox, which he essentially talks about. Oh, you're going to correct me. I was
No, go.
Yeah, he essentially talks about how, until relatively recently, competition law was focused on consumer welfare as being the primary lens through which you judge the effectiveness of a market, and that is now changing, because something like Google is free for the consumer to use, but in fact there are consequences for how the market is operating in the background in the way that Dan described. And of course, Amazon is the same, because it offers a platform for goods and services that is free to access, but it can shape then what you buy through other mechanisms, including prioritizing some results in search, and having the capacity to surveil quite closely its competitors, so it can sell as well as offer people the capacity to sell in a marketplace, and that makes it particularly powerful. And what I think Khan is doing is displacing that method of judging the effectiveness of markets from an antitrust perspective and saying consumer welfare doesn't cut it anymore. And again, that sounds kind of tedious, but I think it is quite radical in the sense that it's a new way to look at the problems that are created by these large tech platforms, which until recently used to sell their credentials or justify themselves and use their social license or create a social license for themselves based on delivering these free services to people, and therefore making the internet better, being able to give people access to things that they don't have to pay for, and then essentially sell their eyeball time to advertisers behind the scenes. And that is a good thing, because it does start to allow us to have a decent conversation as to why this kind of monopolization is very, very damaging, not just to markets, I think, but also how we see the world. How we see the world will be shaped by what Google puts in its top 10 links inevitably, and how companies make money for the purposes of advertising will shape how they show us content. And so all these things are obviously quite intimately linked with the politics of the time, I would argue, not just consumer welfare, not just the freedom of markets, but also, the freedom of individuals and collective ideas of what it is to have a public discussion or a public space. And so I think it is quite critical for that to be exposed, and so we can have a proper conversation about it. But, I'm interested in consumer welfare rights and consumer rights generally, but I think there are bigger questions that are much more important to have as a result of these cases.
It does strike me, Richard, that the fact that laws that are basically set up to protect the integrity of capitalism are the only levers that are really at the disposal of the states to actually control these big tech giants.
That's exactly the point. I would have liked to make it. Larry Summers wrote a paper, in 2000 or something like that, saying that in terms of sort of how capitalism has worked traditionally, data doesn't work. So there was a lot of excitement actually on the left after the global debt crisis, because one, people in that milieu felt that things were sort of coming apart, and two, the technologies, the kind of businesses that were emerging were based on data, which is to use the technical phrase, a zero marginal cost technology, which is to say that it collapses prices because it's a is it a non-rival good? Yes, it's a non-rival good. That's right. So you know what I mean by that. But that means that the only way in which businesses like Amazon and Google can kind of protect themselves is through monopolization. And this was the point, really, that Larry Summers was conceding quite early on in the piece. So I actually think these antitrust developments are quite significant and could have quite interesting consequences. Yeah, interesting to watch.
And listen, the good news doesn't stop there either. We've also got the news out of Hollywood, straight off the phone, that the double strike has reached somewhat of a breakthrough. The Writers Guild of America last week reached agreement with the film and TV producers on their contract. This wasn't a normal contract negotiation, because embedded in the claim were guarantees about the way that artificial intelligence would be used in the development of cultural content. And we've talked about this a couple of weeks ago, We actually ran some research on the Australian public trying to test their level of comfort with AI generated cultural content, and it surprised me the tolerance for both AI generated books and AI generated films, particularly by younger people. Notwithstanding that, placing the protections around this through a industrial and workplace frame seems like it is in sync with the best thinking in how to manage the rollout of AI more broadly across the economy. And I know, Dan, your old profession of the media is also looking at this, the proposition that what is the difference between human generated content and AI generated content in the eyes of a consumer, and should they be told about it? But B, should a human's work be drift netted and repurposed by some form of machine learning? So I don't know if you've been following the dispute and what it means more broadly to human curation and creation of content.
Yeah, I have. I mean, it's a really encouraging outcome, actually. A shame it took this long to get here. Well, parts of it are encouraging, put it that way. What I like about the deal that's been struck is that it kind of preserves, or not kind of, it seems to preserve the best use of the technology while excluding the most harmful. That is, that the writers can utilize AI to, improve their output and whatever else, and remain in control of it. But the studios can't train AI on what has already been created and effectively, exclude humans from the process going forward, which is this kind of makes common sense, I think. It makes common sense for people who care about human creativity, I guess. I think that's a great outcome. Hopefully it sets a precedent for other industries. The point I would make, though, is that it does show that, the writers had power in this. Their strike made a difference. I obviously was comparing this to my old industry in media and news, and the fact that really the news industry doesn't have power in this circumstance. And so as a consequence, what's happened is that these large language models have already gone and trained all their bots and whatever else on the content that has been produced by journalists and Wikipedia and the like, in order to be able to, if someone asks on the origins of the war in Ukraine, for example, then all of these bots can deliver a pretty compelling answer, which has been trained on not ours anymore, on media's content on Wikipedia. And yet, the only way that the media industry can fight back against that is really with collusion, which is outlawed as part of antitrust. So it's much harder for some parts of the industry to fight back against this, because it's just that the genie's already out of the bottle. So anyway, I'm not sure if that's a somber note to finish on, but I'm hopeful that at least the best elements of this deal can be applied to other areas where there's still a chance of fighting back.
How do you look at this as someone that works around employment law? I'm ploughing through a fantastic book, Power and Progress, at the moment by Darren Asamoah, which basically posits that the way to unlock productivity is to put the power of the development of the technology in the hands of the workers and build countervailing power. And it feels like the little sort of guardrails that at least Hollywood's put around their creation is the start of that. But can you see it only being for very privileged, well-paid workers in an elite industry, or can this work more broadly?
I actually think that a lot of the people who have to work very, very closely with technology, whose jobs have transformed significantly in the last 20 years, tend to be people who are lower skilled or classified as lower skilled, because that's a term of art in classification statistics of labour. I think it carries some moral weight, which it shouldn't, because a lot of these jobs that are classified as low skill are in fact highly skilled. I've written about this before, looking at people who work in, for example, fast food industries, in factories and places like Amazon factories, where you have to collaborate extremely closely with technology, and it's often in various ways inefficient or not working well. But these workers sort of have to create workarounds, but they actually are starting to treat it in recent years as an organising issue, that you should be able to put this into workplace agreements and the like. And there's all sorts of unions organising around this, that in fact they become quite high skilled jobs where how workers use this technology can be quite powerful in the sense that it obviously creates inefficiencies for the boss, but it also means that the withdrawal of your labor can be quite significant. But also you can start to have it as something on the table in the course of negotiating the terms of your employment. Amazon is famous for automated terminations, for example, where people didn't meet certain criteria. And I think there's grounds to say that shouldn't be permissible, for example, that these are things that you could put into an agreement if you were an organized workforce. So there's those kinds of more extreme examples, but even things like in places like when I've talked to people who work in supermarkets before, they talk about how automated checkouts mean there's fewer and fewer staff in these kinds of environments, which can make it difficult or unsafe, and that can be a way in which you can start to an axis upon which you can start to organize as well. So it's funny, I think, when you think about technology or artificial intelligence as these very sophisticated high art forms of technology that exist in places like Hollywood, when the reality is that there's lots and lots of automation of middle management, for example, and what are traditionally classified as lower skilled jobs or jobs for which you don't often need a further degree is the reality, more than the weighted term. And that's often a place in which organizing like this has already been going on for some time.
Yeah. The bit I love in the Power and Progress book is the notion that when the technology is driven to either automate or surveil, the benefits just go up and are concentrated in the owners of capital. It's only, and he comes up with the frame MU, machine usefulness. And when the technology is used to create better tools for workers, then that's actually when you unlock productivity and also create a fairer distribution of the benefits of the technology. So that's probably a nice segue into our deep dive with Richard. Your book is part of almost a growing genre in AI horror. There's a number of other books out at the moment. Brian Merchant's Blood in the Machine, Yanis Varoufakis's Techno-Feudalism. So there is a wave here of people that are coming at this from a broader than just a tech perspective. What was the motivation for the book and what was the process on putting it together, Richard?
Yeah, sure. Well, the monsters might be a good place to start an answer to that question. So as your listeners will know, here be monsters or here be dragons. Hic sunt dracones was a phrase that used to appear on old maps in order to indicate uncharted territories. So it's a warning, and the book is a warning, but it's not a warning so much. Well, it is a warning about the technologies themselves, but I don't think that monsters necessarily in here in the technologies themselves. We all know about the sort of the sci-fi cliche of the sort of rogue AI that, becomes so powerful that it crosses some sort of threshold into consciousness and then starts quibbling about who's in charge or, crying at the sight of three-legged dogs, just, depending on who's directing the movie. And that's a form of monster, right? And it's a monster because there's ambiguity about its status in the same way that there's ambiguity about whether or not a zombie is alive or dead, or, whether a vampire is a human being or a bat, and again, alive or dead, I guess. And that's the source of what Freud calls the uncanny. That's why monsters kind of creep us out, because there's ambiguity about their status. What category do they fall into? They're liminal things. They fall between the stools, if you like. What interests me, though, is the extent to which immersion and our increasing immersion in a world of increasingly transformative machines is making us, so to speak, uncanny to one another, to ourselves and to one another. So to what extent and in what ways are these incredibly powerful technologies transforming, or not transforming so much as running against the grain of our human being? And so it's a book about what we want from technology, but the question of what we want from anything, I guess, is also a question about what we are. And it seems to me that the technological developments of recent years are so striking and so so world changing that we really need to be asking some very deep questions about where it is that we're going and what it is that we want.
So can I ask you, talk a bit about Mary Shelley in there and Frankenstein? I just love looking at Victorian characters because I always think they're kind of more interesting than you can ever imagine when you start out investigating them. And I've got a particular fondness for, well, not so much Lord Byron, but more his daughter, Ada Lovelace, as many computer geeks do. But what I was going to ask you was, can you tell us what you think is the biggest kind of misunderstanding, I suppose, about Frankenstein in the modern sense that is worth correcting to better able to understand technology today?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's kind of perhaps not the book. It's people who read the book will I think understand what it's about. I think it's pretty clear. But yeah, if it to the extent that the book, and more than any other book, this book has a kind of afterlife. It has a kind of presence within the culture, doesn't it? That isn't necessarily tied to whether or not you've read it or not. And the idea is that it's a sort of disaster movie type thing. It's kind of, guy goes too far and, he creates this machine. It's the original version, actually, of the rogue AI story that I was talking about before. It's interesting that depictions of Frankenstein, always have the mechanical things, so it's kind of half an AI and half a zombie, actually, he's not described like that, or the monster's not described like that at all in the book. But what the book is actually about, of course, is a man, Victor Frankenstein, who has, if you like, a mechanistic idea of human being, and it's that, and he's depicted as someone who is, if you like, insufficiently educated. Okay, so he thinks that he can, take bits and pieces from these moldering cadavers and sort of bring them together into a human being, because that's what a human being is. It's just, bits of tech, if you like, that you can bring into that you can sort of, synthesize into a new organism. And of course, spoiler alert, it all goes very wrong, as I think people know. So it's sort of that original idea, but it's a lot deeper than that kind of rogue AI story, because it is about a person, Victor, who simply has the wrong idea about the kind of thing that he is and the kinds of things that we are. And I think that's perhaps the not so much a misconception, but the thing that gets lost.
Isn't there a point of unintended consequences that's part of that? I guess it's probably a lesser point, but nonetheless, stay with me. I might lose the floor, but I'll give it a crack. I often think about Steve Jobs describing computing, I think I think it might have been mobile computing as a bicycle for the mind, and starting out with this idea of the tech being able to sort of be used for, I guess, kind of utopian purposes or for progress or whatever else. And I think, look, I'm the resident tech bro in these conversations, so I absolutely am in favor of all the great things that have come, obviously, from the internet and smartphones and everything else. But I think nothing demonstrates where this goes wrong more than when you go to a music concert and you see a moment where, or you have a rare moment where there's a crescendo in the music, or there's a really beautiful point on the concert. And 20 years ago, that would be such a rare moment where you'd often have hundreds or if not thousands of people that would be in that moment for that briefest of time. And it's why you went to a music concert. It's what made it brilliant. And it is absolutely fundamentally destroyed by everyone having a phone in their pocket now, because everyone whips their camera out and takes a video of it for the purpose of putting on social media later. And it just cheapens the experience substantially. Now, clearly, smartphones and everything else have made our lives better in many, many ways, but the downstream consequences of that are really, really negative. And isn't that sort of part of the message of Frankenstein as well, is that you can start with all the best intentions in the world, but because we don't know where the technology will lead us, it ends up enslaving. So I may have lost you all, but tell me if I have.
I think that's a very good point. I mean, it's interesting what you say. It can be used well or it can be used badly. I mean, that broadly speaking is what's called the instrumental view of technology, and it's probably the one that's dominant in Silicon Valley, and it has a lot of currency. The idea is that there is, there are, if you like, just tools. There's just this, this smartphone here, and you can use that well, we can use it badly, and there's nothing particularly about the technology itself that demands examination. But there's another view of technology, which is the one I'm sort of channeling in the book, which is the substantive view, which is the view that technologies both shape and are shaped by the culture into which they emerge. And I think that touches on what you're saying. Of course, I don't think the smartphone would have emerged at all. I think it's clear that the smartphone wouldn't have emerged at all in a society set up along very different lines. So the fact that we have this technology at all is a consequence of the kind of society and the kind of priorities that society has that gave birth to it. And then, yes, there are other unintended consequences. And, looking at your phone in those moments is one of them. But looking at your phone, at all is also one of them. And it's interesting how this device or collection of devices that we call a collection of technologies that we call the smartphone has kind of introduced relations of absence into kind of physical spaces. So whereas once you would walk through a university campus and everybody would be up and about and they wouldn't necessarily be talking to one another, but now they're on their phones, they're all looking down, well, half of them are anyway. I don't want to overstate it. I'd be interested to know what you think the the good things about it are. I mean, yes, they connect us, but it seems to me that in many ways, perhaps the smartphone in combination with social media, what they're doing oftentimes is kind of selling us back the thing that we feel that we lack, which is to say meaningful connection with other people. But what they're doing, especially the social media platforms, of course, is selling it back to us in morbid form. That's to say, in a form that doesn't give us the kind of recognition that we need in order to flourish as human beings. If we didn't know it before COVID, we certainly knew it 1 week into the lockdowns anyway. For whatever reason, human beings need to be in the same space. It's not enough just to have grandma on the screen. You have to have her in the room, maybe not all the time, but some of the time. And we don't do well in circumstances where that's not the case. So I think there's a case that one could make for kind of standing back from screen culture in general and just thinking about the kind of the deep effects and the long-term effects and the deep roots indeed of this form of mediation.
Can I just say that I find that interesting in that I'm not a techceptionalist, but I do, for instance, think this medium where people are in a shared environment, effectively inline rather than online, is really interesting. And Lizzie and Dan and I started doing this over Zooms during lockdown. And I think, it was a couple of years of doing this before we actually all were in the same room at the same time. So it's interesting, though, because there is no real business model behind this interaction, which is why we do it as a hobby. Whereas the bits where the markets take the technology and have their own theory of value and exploitation is when it becomes something other than itself.
Absolutely, yeah, and the absolutely, and it doesn't make sense to be kind of anti-technology or pro-technology. Technological creatures is what we are. The use of stone tools predates the emergence of Homo sapiens by some 3 million years. So we woke up into technology in the same way that anyone listening to this woke up in technology this morning, in the form of blankets and a bed and a roof over their heads. There is no human being without technology. And so what I'm saying is that we need to evolve a more sort of reflective, reflexive relationship to technology where we can think in broad terms, outside of that market paradigm, if you like, about what this might do, about where this comes from, about what it's doing to our kids, etc., etc. And yeah, that's hopefully an interesting way of looking at it, I talk about the techno-critical tradition, which seems to me to have gone rather quiet at exactly the point in history where it's really, really needed. So Neil Postman, who wrote very well about television back in the day, says that technologies are ecological. Okay, so they change the human environment in the same way that a drop of dye changes a glass of clear water. So you add the printing press into old Europe, and you don't get old Europe plus the printing press. You get a different Europe altogether, a Europe from which other technologies that might not have emerged under other circumstances will emerge. Okay, so that's.
But Richard, isn't that a better Europe?
Well, that's an interesting question, Dan. And it's striking how many times printing sort of comes up in these discussions. Well, I introduced it myself, so I can't say that it came up randomly in this case. But when
I'm also perhaps slightly biased of having worked for 20 years in the media. So, but nonetheless, I'd love to know your take.
Yeah, absolutely. But sometimes around 2011, this was very kind of striking. When it was all kicking off in the Maghreb and in the Middle East, and with the Occupy movement and the Indignados and all that kind of stuff, and there was a lot of energy around the new tech and the Facebook revolution, the Twitter revolution. Is that the people, the people who were sort of advocating for this view would say, the people who are, who are asking questions about this stuff they're like the people who are against printing and all that kind of stuff. Well, okay, but let's look at printing. Yes, you get the democratization of religion. Yes, you get the spread of literacy eventually. And yes, you get the emergence of what we now call the public sphere. But you also get imagined communities, by which I mean just the people identifying with people to whom they are not physically present. So you get nationalism, you get imperialism. A guy in Melbourne, a friend of mine, Guy Rundle, the other day in Melbourne, said, he was talking about Gutenbergism, which is a great word. It's his word for the kind of people who think everything before the printing press was primitive, and any kind of alternative to it is just it is not up to snuff. It's kind of stuff that you get in the Australian all the time, And he was saying, the book gives you Auschwitz, and that's not to say, and it does. But that's not to say that printing is a good thing or a bad thing. Yes, human beings make progress. There are also forms of regress in the world. What we need to get away from is that kind of teleological view of human development that is so kind of marbled into the way in which we think about technology. Because, as we know, some of the technologies we have, we would be very happy to be without. People are going to cinemas and watching Oppenheimer at the moment. I can't think of many people that I know who don't think that the world would be a much better and safer place if we didn't have nukes. So even the history of printing is complicated. I would say, and it's not about kind of weighing it on the scales. It's just about evolving a new relationship to it that is more techno-critical, if you like.
I wanted to focus a little bit more on the literature stuff because I like cross-disciplinary approaches to understanding technology, because that's sort of like what I've tried to do, at least in terms of my writing. One of the people that comes to mind when I'm reading about this, and particularly when you're just talking, is Ursula Le Guin, because she writes that essay about how she's criticized often for not being a science fiction writer, because she's got a good quote, and I'm now going to mash it up, but she says something like, most science fiction is interested in penetrating weapons and men hitting each other over the head with blunt objects, that are with lasers, essentially. And I think, and she's always treated as not being properly science fiction because it doesn't involve spaceships and big weapons and stuff like that. And then she has this carrier bag theory of fiction that, in fact, I mean, now I'm kind of verbally her a bit, but the carrier bag is a form of technology, and it's actually a life-giving form of technology. And it's something that was created and kind of managed and used by women who would, collect and store food for periods in which food wasn't available, but it's not treated as technology, and it's not perceived as being life-giving or absolutely critical to our existence. And there's a gendered reason for that, as well as a larger political one that comes from using the power of literature and storytelling to advance a particular vision of technology that serves particular purposes. And like, I was going to ask you, how do you draw a distinction between technology that might be life-giving and technology that isn't? And I realize in your answer about the printing press, like, none of it is either one or the other, but is it about how you frame it or how it's understood through not just law, say, or kind of technical understandings, but in fact like cultural ones as well? Is that a better way to understand what your project is, I suppose, in this book?
I think it is, Lizzie, and I write in the book about it's a bit of a mouthful, but techno-scientific capitalism, and my idea here. So this is if you like the sort of technological and come political, come economic ensemble that concerns me most. So this is how I try to think of it, and I agree with your example of the carrier bag is excellent, and there are other technologies as well, which of course you wouldn't want to be without. Anesthetics is an obvious one, right? Absolutely life-changing, but history changing. But techno-scientific capitalism, what's happened, and it's had deep roots, goes right back to the Enlightenment, where people began to sort of view the universe as a sort of a gigantic mechanism, different parts which are kind of set in train by the other parts and all that sort of thing, with a view of humanity as well that sort of emerged from that. It goes right back to the Enlightenment and to the scientific revolution. What's happened is that science, generally speaking, broadly speaking, and very roughly speaking, science, which used to enjoy a degree of autonomy, if you like, as natural philosophy, as it used to be called, has now been largely subordinated to questions of practical utility. That's to say, it's been subordinated to the much older enterprise that we call technological development. And those two things together, and that's done, a couple of things come from that. One, it means that the theoretical has blended with the practical in a way that you can see, for example, in the Los Alamos experiment, which basically took an equation that Einstein didn't think had any practical application in the world and gave it practical application. That's to say, this is not a process that occurs anywhere on Earth. It reached back, if you like, into pre-nature, into the heart of stars, to give effect to something utterly transformative. So that's one thing. The other thing is that both of those things together have now been largely subordinated to the market, to profit, to capital, etc. So this is the big cultural shift that's happened, it seems to me. And of course, yes, you're absolutely right. Not all of technology falls into that category, because most technology that we have and use precede that world. The pencil, there's no need to fit the pencil into that into that frame. But what I want to do in thinking culturally about it, as you say, is to make the point that this is what's new, and that the new and emerging technologies that have the potential to transform the world, not merely to bend capricious nature to our will, but to intervene in it at the smallest levels, at the level of the atom, in nanotechnology, in nuclear power, at the level of the cell, at the level of the molecule, up to and including, as we know, human DNA molecules, with CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing now. So this is huge, and these areas are converging in a way that makes all of the single areas, the nanotech, the genetics, etc., very much more powerful. We couldn't have mapped the human genome, for example, if it hadn't been for AI. But yeah, that's what I want to say in the book, and it is there. It follows from that it's now very important to sort of blow the dust off this more techno-critical way of looking at technology, with a view to subjecting it to that kind of cultural analysis.
Can we round out the conversation with a question, which is, are there any stories or songs that can help us think our way through? Like, I think literature's been great at making us aghast, but what is the way through here, if you're our guide?
Well, songs, stories, I don't know. Start with Frankenstein, I guess. That's a pretty good place to start. It's kind of quite it pops up quite early on in the book, so I find it difficult to get away from that. Yeah, I mean, much as I hate to say it because I love the movies, probably avoid Kubrick and all that sort of stuff, because I think that kind of leads us away from what we really need to think about. I suppose what I would say about how we go forward, and it's a slightly dull answer to your more colourful question, is that we need to repoliticize technology, and I mean really, I mean beyond questions of regulation. It needs to become again central to the question of how we live in community with others. And there was a lot of that stuff around in the 1960s and the 1970s as the left became less Promethean and began to question the role of technology in society, Frankfurt School stuff, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring, all that sort of thing. A movement, by the way, as Lizzie will know, to which women were far more central than they had been in left discourse up to that point. And we need to repoliticize it. I find it incredible. Even parties now that are sort of nominally socially, fairly radically social democratic are quite techno-solutionist in their approach to the world. And what if there's one point I would like to make, it's that we need to yes, we need technological innovation. I'm excited about 3D printing. I'm excited about renewables. Of course, I am excited about zero marginal cost technologies of different kinds. But we also need, that needs to be cut with political and social and economic innovation as well. And it's only then that you can build it into you can really think radically about the future. And that means, it's not the work of a year, it's not the work of a decade, it's the work of many decades, I'm sure. But that means changing what we teach in schools. It means changing the way we consume and produce. It means bringing things closer to communities. It means, permaculture products. It means, not just about, ChatGPT and how we're going to fit it into education, but whether we want to spend so much time on computers at all, or indeed whether we want to be spending so much time writing at all. Why aren't kids outside, in the school garden thinking about what they can and can't grow, or, as per the old industrial workshops that they used to have in the US, learning how to work on their houses and all that sort of thing. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Building that into the system in that way. And that's before, of course, you get to the big ticket stuff like, socializing Google and getting the new internet that Dan was speaking so eloquently about, which I'm all for. It's amazing to me, just as a sidebar on this, that so many people in my, one of the things I do is just a bit of tutoring, and so many people in that cohort, teachers, lecturers, and so on, are very sort of incorporationist when it comes to these things like ChatGPT, and it only emerged a few months ago. I set my students a question on an essay on ChatGPT. I don't mean I asked them. I don't mean I got them to write it on ChatGPT, but about ChatGPT. Although some of them obviously got confused. But anyway, they're all very fatalistic. It's like, this thing is in the world now. We need to live with it and all this sort of thing. And a lot of the lecturers are like that too. This is a cohort that jumped up and down for 15 years about bloody Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is a great website, isn't it? And not only is it a great website, but it's the internet we could have had. Well, we didn't get it.
On that note, final thoughts and reflections. Thanks, Richard. I've just got a pretty hard finish for this session. I should say before we do final thoughts and reflections, just that the three of us, Lizzie, Dan, and I, are going to be on a panel at South by Southwest in a couple of weeks on the Wednesday. If you are going to be around Sydney for that event, come and say hi. Lizzie.
The last thing I'll say is I think the pitch for understanding what the world should be like in relation to technology is The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, because it's a Le Guin novel, or the short story, which actually says that none of us are free until all of us are free. And if a utopian society, whether it's technological or not, depends on the oppression of people, we need to say no. So I think there is some literature there that gives you a path through, and that's one example. Yeah.
And it's a great critique, if I may just barge in, it's a great critique of utilitarianism and shows you why utilitarianism can't ground moral philosophy. And utilitarianism is central to capitalism, of course.
On that note, thanks everyone. I don't even have time for Dan's final reflection. Got to be at Punch Bowl at 3:30. See you guys. Have a good one.
Bye.
See you, folks.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Burning Platforms, a fortnightly podcast from the Centre for Responsible Technology. It was recorded on October 5 and produced on Gadigal land by Jennifer Macy. Talk again soon.